Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me for another true crime video. I just got back from CrimeCon last night at like 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm recording this morning. I'm exhausted, but we had such a great time in Austin. I cannot wait to tell you all about it. There's so many cases I want to cover, so many people I got to talk to. Just a really amazing time. So I'll probably go live sometime next week and we'll just talk about CrimeCon and I can answer your questions and everything like that. But today we're talking about something that's recently been in the news. And I'm sure you've seen the story that we're going to talk about today. And if you haven't heard about it, you're going to hear about it now because it's a very important and chilling piece of our shared history as a world. Even though what we're talking about right now happened in Canada, it happened here in the United States too, and we need to discuss it. I truly believe that knowledge is power and understanding of history is power. It prevents us from repeating the same mistakes. The more people out there who know about the awful atrocities that have happened in the past, the less likely that they are to be repeated in the future because hopefully we'll know better. Just this week, the remains of 215 children were found buried in a mass grave on the site of the old Kamloops residential school in British Columbia. And for those of you who aren't super familiar with Canadian history, you might be wondering what happened to these children. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, GlassesUSA.com. By cutting out the middleman, GlassesUSA.com offers prescription glasses and sunglasses at up to 70% off retail prices. Now you can shop for all your eyewear needs online at affordable prices without leaving home. GlassesUSA.com offers over 9,000 styles of eyeglasses and sunglasses, including in-house brands like Muse and Amelia E. Take, for example, the glasses I'm wearing right now, the Amelia E. Francesca in green. And these ones here, the Amelia E. Adis, that I've been wearing a lot these last few months when I'm recording videos, and you all have been saying you love them. In fact, I think that I've gotten more comments and compliments on this pair of glasses than probably any of the ones I've ever worn. GlassesUSA.com also has designer brands like Ray-Ban, Oakley, Armani, Gucci, and more. Like these guys right here. These are the Ray-Ban 5228 in green and tortoise. Now, I know I have a lot of green glasses because green is my favorite color. But you can find every conceivable style and color, as well as specialty glasses like glasses for kids or for sports. And if you're nervous about buying glasses online because you don't know how they'll look, which is understandable, GlassesUSA.com's virtual try-on tool will put your mind at ease. It's so much easier and less stressful to try on as many pair of glasses as I want online instead of having to be at a store, trying to keep one eye on the kids, trying to keep one eye on the time. So I usually just end up picking the first frame that looks semi-okay. I'm not super happy with it, instead of spending the actual time that it takes to really browse through and find a frame that I actually love. And I found so many frames on GlassesUSA.com that I love because I've had the time to just go through and try them on. And it's just a very relaxed experience because you're home. You can do it at night when you're sitting there with a glass of wine after everybody's gone to bed and just really enjoy the whole process of picking out glasses because it should be fun. You can also add any type of prescription to almost any pair of frames, including sunglasses, like these ones, these Oakley frog skins. I love these sunglasses so much. I think I wore them the entire time I was in Austin. I love them. GlassesUSA.com also has a free app called a prescription scanner, which you can use to scan your current glasses, and that helps you figure out what your prescription is, and that saves you time and money. It's so easy. It takes under 10 minutes. And when you're done, you can just immediately start picking out your glasses instead of waiting for a prescription from your doctor or an eye exam. GlassesUSA.com's lenses are the same high quality you'll find in any glasses store, and they're made in their state-of-the-art labs. And if your prescription includes bifocal or progressive lenses, you don't have to worry. GlassesUSA.com can accommodate any type of prescription. A complete pair of eyeglasses or sunglasses starts at just $30, and free basic prescription lenses are included with every frame, which is such a good deal. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description box and find your next favorite pair of glasses today. GlassesUSA.com is a risk-free shopping experience with free shipping and returns. They'll give you a 100% money-back guarantee if you don't absolutely love your glasses within 14 days of delivery. No questions asked. They also give you a 365-day product warranty. They have contact lenses too. They have everything. I love Glasses USA. I'll never get my glasses from any place else. So thank you so much to GlassesUSA.com for sponsoring this video, and let's dive in. So for decades in Canada, Children of Indigenous families were stolen from their homes and forced into residential schools, which is basically, in my opinion, just a fancy name for a reprogramming facility. A large number of these children never made it home. They maybe ran away, disappeared, became victims of violent crimes, or they died from mistreatment or illness. Yet their loved ones were never given answers as to what had happened to their precious children. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission estimates that at least 4,100 children died while attending these residential schools that had been opened all over the country of Canada. And for many decades, there have been rumors among the Indigenous people of Canada that those missing children would be found buried in mass graves on the school grounds.
And we understand that you had heard rumors about this mass grave when you were a student there.
Yeah, I was a student there. We didn't react too much with the lower grades. You know, like we were in grade 12. Mm-hmm. We all lived in the same building, and there was rumors of a graveyard, but nobody seemed to know where it was, and we didn't even know if it was true. And there was a big orchard there, and we used to make up stories about the graveyard being in the orchard.
But they were just rumors until now, because the discovery at Kamloops is the first time a major burial site has ever been discovered. But to understand what happened at the end, we have to go back to the beginning. And I want to be very clear, very transparent with you. And we're all adults here, so I think we can understand where I'm coming from. There are going to be times in this video that I'm going to use the word Indian. I'm not being offensive, but this is history. And when I'm talking about specific governmental acts or quoting key figures from that time, I'm going to use the words that they used. And it's going to shock you. And it should shock you. I want it to shock you because we don't use that word. As we know, Indigenous people are not from India and should never have been called Indians. But Christopher Columbus was a moron, so here we are. But I want you to also understand how the people at the time viewed Indigenous people, how they referred to them, how they spoke about them. It's going to be shocking, but it wouldn't be impactful if it wasn't. However, it is my advice that you should never refer to an Indigenous or Native person as an Indian unless they prefer to be called that, and then they'll let you know. And I know some of them don't mind, but that really needs to be up to them. So let's talk a little bit about the history. When Europeans arrived in the New World, it wasn't very new. There were already many people living there, many communities of people who inhabited North America. Some of them were nomadic, they moved around. Some lived in permanent and settled communities. The term First Nations refers to some 617 different communities who lived in North America long before the first European settler ever set foot on this land. And historians have divided them into 6 groups based on geography. For example, the Woodland First Nations, who occupied forested areas of eastern Canada. Each group had their own traditions, songs, food, and a rich culture that was passed down for generations by word of mouth, from mother to daughter and father to son. There was a long time that the native peoples of North America, they didn't have a written language. They passed it down through story, through song, through tradition. The family unit has always been incredibly important to Indigenous people, and in my opinion, that is a big part of why the Canadian government and the United States government tried to destroy these people. And in a lot of ways, they succeeded, which makes me even more angry. In Canada, we also have the Inuit people, the Arctic Indigenous population, and the Métis, who are the descendants of Indigenous people and French settlers. So when the Europeans showed up, admittedly, the Native people were sort of a fascination to them. But I believe that they also gave these Europeans a way to feel superior, because although these new settlers, these new colonists, they were very interested in different cultures and curious about what was outside of their narrow worldview, they also saw people who had not developed a written culture as inferior. Because Indigenous people lived a more primitive life, because they had not yet been exposed to the technology that Europeans had been exposed to, they were seen by many as being closer to animals than humans. In 1683, French priest Louis Hennepin wrote about the indigenous people that he had met, saying, quote, "The Indians trouble themselves very little with our civilities. Men and women hide only their private parts. They eat in a snuffling way and puffing like animals. They put no restraint on their actions." End quote. Christians who ventured to the New World had a more positive view of the indigenous people than others, I guess. The missionaries felt that they were kind of like Adam and Eve. So the indigenous people were Adam and Eve, living in their Garden of Eden, almost like children, in ignorance and sin. They called them noble savages and believed that with time, teaching, and religion, these primitive people could be assimilated into European culture. And that's a scary word, assimilate. I hate it. It never means anything good when used in terms of society. Never. It pretty much means you live in a way that we don't like and or we don't understand, so we don't want you to live that way anymore. We want you to live in the way that we live, in the way that we believe is the best to live, so that we can accept you more, because we can't accept you while we don't understand or approve of the way you live. And this is a very slippery slope. It's counterproductive, and it's a damaging way to live as a society together, because nobody's the same and everybody has different ways of living and different beliefs, and we really need to start accepting that about each other more instead of trying to change the other person or the other community, or trying to make that other person or other community more like us so that we can like them better or accept them. This belief that the native peoples were like children who needed guidance to know the difference between right and wrong and to become productive members of society, it was very problematic because the Europeans felt that the native people, they weren't going to take the initiative for themselves to change for the better, according to them, right? So, of course, the white man had to force it on them because that was what was best for them. And they just didn't know that because they were ignorant children living in sin, living in the Garden of Eden. But one day they would see it and they would appreciate it and they would be better off for it. This belief, this idea, was the precursor to Canada's residential school system. 300 years after Christopher Columbus started calling people Indians because he was too dumb to know where he actually was, England and France began sending groups of people over to the New World to live there, to take the land for their own, and to impose their own way of living and laws on a whole bunch of people who'd been just fine before. This is called colonization, and the monarchies of these European countries, they loved that shit. Before this, there had been Europeans, and they showed up every once in a while. They would trade with the indigenous peoples. They would bring them items that were exotic to the natives in return for furs and meat. They would go fishing or whaling, and then they would return to wherever the hell they'd come from to sell these things back home. FacingHistory.org states that Indigenous people in Canada met their European counterparts on more or less equal terms, with mutual benefits and agreements between the settlers and the natives that guaranteed the Indigenous people had the right to protect and use their land for as long as the sun shines, for as long as the river flows, and the grass grows. But then there was a change in Europe. Furs were becoming less in demand. There was a wide availability of newer and cheaper fabrics, and this was becoming the popular fashion, so the fur trade stopped being as profitable. Plus, by this time, Europeans had traveled further west, and they'd discovered all sorts of cool natural resources that they could capitalize on, like gold. And the Europeans didn't need the indigenous people to get them gold, as they had depended on them to trap the animals from which they would get their furs. So when the indigenous people no longer served the Europeans, they no longer wanted to have these agreements with them. They wanted to force them to be the way they wanted them to be. And in 1754, France and Great Britain, who, I truly believe have been mortal enemies since before the words mortal enemies was even a thing, they started fighting over North America. And each side recruited First Nations peoples to join in on the battle. This would become known as the 7 Years' War. It would end in 1763 when France ceded most of its territory to Great Britain. God save the Queen. But once the French had been defeated, with the help of some of the natives, might I add, the most pressing question on the minds of the British monarchy was, what do we do with these people now, these native people? Britain wanted to have peace for the most part, but they also had a desire to just take whatever the hell they wanted with no pushback from the people who'd been living on the land for thousands of years and who still dominated much of Canada. And there were a lot of tribes who had sided with the French during the 7-Year War, and they developed close bonds with them. So when Great Britain won, there was still a lot of tension. Minavavan, a Chippewa leader in French Canada, sent a message to Great Britain after the war, saying, quote, "Englishman, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods and mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none. Your nation supposes that we, like the white people, cannot live without bread and pork and beef. But you ought to know that he, the Great Spirit and Master of life, has provided food for us in these spacious lakes and on these woody mountains." End quote. So, I mean, he's pretty much saying the same thing, right? Like, leave us be. We have what we need. We don't need the extra stuff. We don't need the technology. We don't need any of your fancy spices. We don't need any of your fancy clothing. We are fine. We've always been fine and will continue to be fine. In 1763, King George III put out the Royal Proclamation, and this was intended to maintain steady relations between the natives and the Europeans. This proclamation was the first official acknowledgement that the First Nations had pre-existing rights to the land, pre-existing rights that predated the European settlements, and it prompted many treaties between the settlers and the indigenous people. But the king also decreed that no single person or colony could purchase land from the natives. And this gave the crown, the English crown, a monopoly on the New World, pretty much. The proclamation also created clear boundaries for the new British province of Quebec, and it reserved the vast territory beyond the Appalachian Mountains for indigenous people. So it was all great, right? Everyone got along. No one tried to change anyone. Everyone accepted each other's differences and embraced the places where they were the same. And we all lived happily ever after. But that's not what happened, is it? It would have been great. It would have been great. Imagine the amazing world that we would have lived in today if that's what had happened. But it's not. It's not what happened. In the 1830s, colonization increased in Canada, and these new settlers were less interested in joining hands and singing around a fire, and more interested with destroying the entire native population by whatever means necessary. They started by creating laws and regulations meant to control and manage the indigenous populations. By the end of the 19th century, 90 to 99% of the 100 million indigenous people in the Americas were gone. Most of them had been killed off by diseases brought from Europe that the indigenous people's immune systems had never encountered before, like smallpox, measles, and the flu. So it took them out because they didn't have an immunity to it. Many scholars at this time publicly spoke out and publicly worried that the effects of European colonialism was going to cause the extinction of the indigenous people of Canada. And I think that's an important distinction to make, an important fact to realize. We like to blame everybody at that time for what happened, but it wasn't really the way it was. You know, obviously there was bad people, but a lot of this was being driven by the British monarchy and then by the new forms of government being set up in the New World. So it was kind of coming from the top. And there was a lot of people, smart people, who looked at what was happening and said, this isn't good. And we need to make a change, or we're going to see that we're going to take an entire population of people who haven't done anything wrong and basically make them extinct. And it is kind of nice to know that in all these times of history where there's really gross violations of human rights happening, there were people who stood up and said, this isn't right, who stood up and did what was right. And that's encouraging. It gives me a little bit more faith in humanity to think about that. And I think we all need a little faith in humanity right now. It wasn't just the diseases that hurt these native peoples, though. There were outright murders. There was land theft on a massive scale, as well as an exhaustion of natural resources that would starve some of these people out. Overfishing, overhunting, cutting down trees, things like that. So the Crown started moving the native populations onto reserves, where they were encouraged to settle down, stop being nomadic, learn a trade, and read the Bible. There were still treaties, but they were no longer treaties that helped the indigenous people or treated them as equals. They were treaties that were meant to control the native populations and keep them out of the way of the European expansion. In 1876, a Department of Indian Affairs officer spoke to a group of First Nations people, and he said, quote, "Many years ago, you were in darkness, killing each other and making slaves was your trade." That's ironic. The land was of no value to you. The trees were of no value to you. The coal was of no value to you. The white man came. He improved the land. You can follow his example. He cuts the trees and pays you to help him. You are improving fast. The government protects you. You are rich. You live in peace and have everything you want. End quote. How condescending, how incredibly insulting. Well, first of all, this is a very clear example of government overreach, of what happens when you give the government too much power. They won't ever say like, hey, you guys are giving us too much power. This isn't in your best interest. They'll just keep taking it until you refuse to give it anymore. And I think it's important to recognize that in our world today, that we are all independent people. We all have rights to freedom, freedom of speech, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And when we sense that our government's trying to take that away from us, we should stand up and say something about it, because there's no going back once that happens. You know, it's much harder, I should say, when you give and you're not getting back anything in return. It's harder to reverse that process, because now policies would have already been put into place that don't serve you, but serve the government. And this is what happened to these Native peoples. They thought that these white men did have their best interest at heart. At least some of them did. There was people that fought back, but a lot of the Native populations were like, okay, this is great. Why would they hurt us? We haven't done anything to them. Why would they want to, harm us or take from us? And in that way, I suppose they were naive like children, but I wish we could all be naive like children in that way and have it actually be the case. Have it be the case where we can trust people and we can trust those in power to have our best interests at heart. And they had to learn that lesson the hard way. Half of their land was stolen. And yes, I'm going to get arguments in the comment section where people are going to say, oh no, they paid for it. Yes, okay, but it was stolen, all right? Treaties and contracts were drawn up in English with complicated terminology that these Native peoples had no idea what any of it meant. They didn't understand. They trusted. And so the indigenous people would be paid a small, very small one-time fee, but that would cause them to lose their land forever. So for instance, we take the island of Manhattan, or New York City. Was bought from the Native Americans at that time by the Dutch for, I don't know the exact term, they said 60 guilders, but definitely like under $100, right? And at that time, the indigenous people thought that this was probably a good deal, but was it? Looking at what New York City became, probably not. And I did read an article on a blog, and it claims, like, it actually says, quote, the Native Americans were not as dumb or naive as they are portrayed, and the Europeans are not as intelligent as they were portrayed. The truth is somewhere in the middle. So they're basically saying, like, the story's a little bit more complicated. I'll link that if you want to read it. But regardless, once again, looking at what New York City became, looking at how it was built up, you kind of feel that whoever sold it should have probably gotten a little bit more bang for their buck. And I think we can agree that that is hard to disagree about. By the mid-1800s, Canada was focused on building a nation that did not involve the presence of Indigenous people. Herman Merivale was a professor at Oxford University from 1837 to 1842, and in this capacity, he delivered a course of lectures on the British colonies, where he discussed questions about immigration, employment of labor, and the allotment of public lands. Herman believed that the control of Indian affairs in the colonies was essential in order to maintain law and order and to civilize the native population. In 1841, he developed 4 policy alternatives that could be used in order to solve the Indian question or the Indian problem. It was referred to as both of these things back then. And the question or the problem was basically, what do we do with them? Herman Merivale and most of Great Britain viewed the Indigenous people as less than, like the Irish or the poor in their own country. Many liberal, British-minded people wanted to better the lives of the Indigenous peoples by force, if necessary. And this is another thing that we see commonly even today. I talked about it a little bit in a previous video where I got comments in my comment section where people were saying, oh, their house probably looks like that because they are poor and poor people live like that. And I responded, and I think I pinned the comment, and I said, this is incredibly offensive to any person who's living like at the poverty line or below, because you can't look at like a house that's in squalor and be like, oh, poor people live there because that's how poor people live. Because plenty of people who are not wealthy still have a lot of pride in their home and their living space, even though they may not have like 20 million inch TVs and all the amenities, they're still going to make sure that their house is clean and taken care of and that it reflects their character. So to say that, oh, the house looks bad because poor people live there, this is a very almost too liberal mindset where like we have to now care for poor people and we have to excuse that they live like this because they're poor. But most poor people don't live like that. And some very wealthy people live like pigs. You know, it's just all about what your internal mechanisms are. It's not necessarily a reflection on the amount of money you have in your bank account. So sometimes I think people go so liberal where they look at people who are disenfranchised and say, we need to treat them like children, right? We need to care for them and we need to help them because they cannot help themselves. And I think a lot of people who are in those groups would disagree. They would say, we're doing all right. We appreciate your kindness, but we also don't want you to treat us like our lives suck or our lives are bad, because we are making the best of what we have and we're happy and we love our families and we make sure that our house is nice and picked up and is the best it can be. So I would like to also maybe warn people away from that. So I see it a lot. So at this time, you had a lot of people in Great Britain who thought they were doing the right thing, who thought they were being kind to the natives by coming in and helping them when the native peoples were like, we don't want your help, we were fine. So these were Herman Merivale's 4 policies for how to deal with the Indian problem or the Indian question. Extermination by death or disenfranchisement, slavery, insulation, meaning to put them on a reserve or reservation, and assimilation. So we've got extermination, insulation, slavery, and assimilation. These all sound like really good options. What about just leave them alone? What about leave them alone? Why was that not one of the policies? Now, Herman Merivale would later go on to become the Secretary of State for the Canadian colonies because he had such great ideas, I guess. In 1844, the Bagot Commission proposed federally run residential schools. They said that they could be an effective tool to separate Indigenous children from their parents, thus forcing them away from their traditions and their cultures and their identity, pretty much, and thus allowing them to assimilate into Western culture. It was also mandated that an individual could only carry one legal status. So you were either an Indian or a citizen, which ended up disenfranchising most Native people in Canada by forcing British citizenship on them, which would completely erase their tribal identity and nationality, because only until you had that citizenship could you do things like own land and vote and be a part of government. This commission also made it illegal to sell alcohol to Indigenous people, along with a variety of other stupid and discriminatory policies. It basically said that land ownership would now be an individual thing, so tribes and communities that had previously shared land together and lived on land together for hundreds of years, they would be moved off this land, and they would either get their own land if they accepted British citizenship, or they'd be moved to a reserve if they didn't. And that was basically their only options. In 1846, a man named P.G. Anderson, he was the superintendent of Indian Affairs, he stated at the General Council of Indian Chiefs, quote, "It is because you do not feel or know the value of education. You would not give up your idle and roaming habits to enable your children to receive instruction. Therefore, you remain poor, ignorant, and miserable. It is found you cannot govern yourselves, and if left to be guided by your own judgment, you will never be better off than you are at the present, and your children will ever remain in ignorance. It has therefore been determined that your children shall be sent to schools, where they will forget their Indian habits and be instructed in all the necessary arts of civilized life and become one with your white brethren." End quote. So they weren't even hiding it, right? At least our government today has the good sense to lie to us about things, about certain regulations and policies that they say are for our own good, but actually strip us of our liberty and rights. Back then, they were shameless because they literally felt that they were not wrong. They felt that this was what was best for them, and they didn't really care what it looked like. But can you imagine someone standing in front of you and telling you that your children are going to be sent someplace so that they can forget who they are, where they come from, what you've taught them, what you've taken great care to remember and retain from your parents and your grandparents and their parents? With the amount of power that the government in Canada and America has been building for hundreds and hundreds of years, you might not have to imagine it because it could become a reality one day. That brings us to the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. It was the first government-funded residential school, and it would become the one that operated for the longest. It didn't close its doors until 1969. Now, it wasn't the last residential school to close. It was just open for the longest. I believe the last residential school closed in 1996. The Mohawk Residential School was originally operated by the Anglican Church of Canada on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve. It was established on 350 acres of land, all of which had once belonged to the Six Nations at some point. In 1831, it began operating as a day school for Indigenous boys, and girls were allowed to enroll the following year. So at first, these residential schools were basically day schools. So they would bring the children from wherever they were living with their family and their tribes and their people, and they would bring them to the school for the day and then send them home afterwards. But as we'll see, this becomes a problem because the children were being sent back home, where they would just continue to learn the things that the Canadian government didn't want them to learn. So we will see the exact moment as we continue on where they decided that day schools weren't a good idea anymore and they should be more like boarding schools. Indigenous girls were allowed to enroll the following year, and between 1854 and 1869, this place was actually destroyed by a fire, but then it was rebuilt a few hundred meters away from its original location. Around this time, the school acquired more land, and farming became a huge part of the students' day-to-day lives. So basically, the students were like slaves. But that's just my opinion. Don't come for me. Before we talk specifically about the Mohawk Residential School, let's talk about how these children came to arrive at this school, as well as many of the other residential schools that popped up all across Canada, and what happened to them when they got there, what their lives were like. These schools were housed inside churches or church-owned buildings, and the children living there faced an incredible amount of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse on a daily basis. The death tolls of children at these schools was so high that on average, nearly 6% of children who entered never made it out. For specific schools, this number would be much higher. For instance, the Thunderchild Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan, 10% of the children died in 1901, 15% in 1928, and 7% in 1931. The purpose of the residential school was to eliminate all aspects of Indigenous culture. Some of the students were sent there willingly by their parents. I don't really believe that. That's how it's reported, but I don't believe that many parents were given much of a choice. So many other children, however, were taken by force, especially after the Indian Act of 1876 and a law in 1892 which made it illegal for Indigenous children to attend regular public schools. Nicholas Flood Davin was a parliamentary war correspondent in England before he arrived in Toronto in 1872, at which point he started working for the Globe. He's considered one of the main architects of the Canadian residential school system because he was sent by the Canadian government to the United States in 1878 to investigate Indigenous education there. Davin was impressed with the U.S.'s efforts to concentrate Native people on reservations. He was also impressed with how the Native children in the States were attending industrial schools. He believed these boarding schools were far more effective than day schools because with day schools, you were still sending the children back home at the end of the day to what he called the influence of the wigwam. Industrial boarding schools, in his opinion, were the best option for Natives to be merged and lost within the nation. These are his words. In a confidential report he wrote to the Canadian government in 1879, Davin said, quote, "The residential school is the principal feature of the policy known as aggressive civilization," end quote. Davin said that the Native culture was uncivilized, and the aim of the education that he wanted to create in Canada was to, quote, "destroy the Indian," end quote. Davin said that creating these schools from scratch would be too expensive, so he suggested using already established churches to carry out their plan. In 1888, Canada's first Prime Minister, John Macdonald, authorized the creation of the residential school system. In 1885, traditional Native ceremonies were declared illegal in Canada. And in 1892, the Canadian government and Christian churches entered into a formal agreement that these new boarding schools, not day schools, would be government funded, but run by the church. It would be against the law for Indigenous people to attend a regular public school until 1945, which does not sound like it's that long ago, because it's not. Most of the children were taken by force. You will never convince me that a good majority of parents handed their kids over. The government would send an official to their homes, and the parent would have to let them take their child or they would face imprisonment. The parents would also be required to sign over custody of their children to the principal or the superintendent of the school. Some children would just be kidnapped off the street. Literally, they'd just be walking down the street and they would be grabbed up with their parents and their community, never even knowing what happened to them. Just they considered them missing. They would be taken long distances away from their homes, even if there was a school close by, because the distance would make it harder for their parents to visit, and obviously much more difficult for these young children to run away. And they took these kids young, some as young as 3, 4 years old. They took them when they were that little so that they could get to them sooner. Some parents would travel hundreds and thousands of miles to camp out near the school that their child was in, just hoping for a glimpse of their baby outside, just hoping to see and have reassurance that their child was okay. Once at the school, the children would be kept prisoner. In fact, they were often referred to as inmates, not students. They would then be forcibly stripped of their language, their clothes, their religion, their culture, traditions, identity. 77-year-old Jenny Spyglass is a survivor of these schools, and she remembers that when she was 3, a government official showed up in a black Jeep. She didn't speak English at this time, so she didn't know what was going on. But she said that these Indian agents, so they weren't native peoples, they were called Indian agents. They were not Native American. The agents and priests were like yelling at her mother and pointing their fingers at her, and her mother was crying, so she definitely knew something was wrong. But it wasn't until she was torn from her mother's arms and the agents took her and threw her in the back of their vehicle and drove away that she realized something was really wrong. They brought her to the Thunder Child Residential School, where she lived for the next 3.5 years. These agents would take all the children in the family, but they wouldn't let them communicate or see each other once at the school. A few weeks after she got there, Jenny saw her brother, one of her brothers, during church. He was sitting in the boys section, and she was barely 4. She didn't know any better. She was lonely. She hadn't seen anybody in her family in weeks, so she ran over to give him a hug. She said a nun immediately grabbed her and locked her in a dark room in the basement, and she was left there all day. She said she thought that she was just left there to die, and that she cried, but at some point she realized there was no use in crying any longer because no one was going to hear her, and no one was going to come and save her. And she was like 4 years old, a little under 4 years old at this point. Can you imagine the trauma that she experienced? Over the next 3 years, most of her brothers and sisters would run away except for her older brother, who died from tuberculosis. And when he died, she was forbidden to mourn him. She was forbidden to do what they would do in their culture to mourn him or to even cry or feel sad. It was a punishable offense.
2 boys ran away. They brought them back and they had perished. They had died, and they brought them back on toboggans. And we were all assembled in the front yard, just like a prisoner of war camp. And there were kids crying, and my sisters recount 2 girls especially that were just, their tears were flowing, and the nuns were saying, "Be quiet, keep quiet," as this happened. I felt like I had to button down anything personal into my mind, like lock it away, because it doesn't apply here. And you survive. You got to survive.
Ron Short, a former RCMP officer, was assigned to an RCMP territorial jail about 50 years ago. This was the mid-'60s. And one day he was assigned to assist an agent of the residential school system. They were tasked with picking up 2 girls, 2 sisters, and bringing them to a school. I believe these girls were 6 and 8. Ron said that they walked into the house and the mother immediately knew why they were there. She was crying. The 2 little girls were crying. All 3 of them were just clinging onto each other. And Ron had to remove a little 6-year-old crying girl from her mother's arms and hand this little girl over to an agent. And she would never see her mother again. And he said years and years later, he heard something about the residential schools, like somebody just brought it up in conversation, and he had a panic attack, PTSD kind of symptoms. And only after therapy did he realize the connection, that this was very traumatic for him. I mean, obviously it's traumatic for them, but he said he was just following orders. He didn't know what was happening at the residential schools. He didn't know that this was wrong, really, because this was just very common. And Ron, he said that he doesn't remember those little girls' names, but he will never forget their cries. When the children arrived at the school, the removal of their identity started right away. They were either given European names or just a number. Their hair was cut the same, they were given identical clothes to wear, European clothes, and their days were structured down to the minute. Every day it was the same thing, very military-esque. Wake up, go to school, work, go to church, eat, go to bed, and this would repeat day after day, only being interrupted by periods of incredibly intense physical and sexual abuse. They were not allowed to speak their own language, and they would be punished daily until they learned to speak English. There were always punishments for even the smallest infraction, and a lot of the times, these kids didn't even know what they were being punished for. Survivors of these residential schools say that you would never know when you had crossed the line, and the way that they let you know was by beating you. Bud Whiteeye, a survivor of a residential school, talked about something called the press room. The children would go in one at a time and be beaten with a leather strap that all of the staff, including the principal, carried. He said, quote, "They were beaten until their screams echoed out to the yards and among the barns, down the lane and up the city streets, beaten until there was silence," end quote. Bud himself was sexually assaulted, molested, raped multiple times. He and other survivors point to the boiler room in the basement as the area this happened because no one could hear their screams over the noise of the boiler. Bud said he would leave this boiler room feeling so dirty, so shamed, and at first he felt that every kid out there had known what was happening to him, but then he realized that it was probably happening to all of them too because no one ever questioned him about what happened in the boiler room, so he figured that they already knew. Bud said, quote, "From within, we each had our own battles to fight. We were lost, lonely, scared, and confused, where our biggest battle was to keep our secrets. Our lives were shrouded in secrecy. No one could know, yet we all collectively knew that kids were being raped and molested in large numbers," end quote. Bud said that even though they lived in fear, many kids still tried to escape, and students escaping became such a problem that some schools built prison cells to hold them in the basement. And these were more like dark closets with deadbolts. These children would be locked in there, sometimes for days at a time, with no human connection, with no food, with nobody coming to check on them. A former student who was housed at a residential school between, I think it was 1941 and 1945, she remembers that she would be shocked if she wet the bed. She said, quote, "They used to bring in a battery, a motor of some sort, or some kind of gadget, and he would put the girl's hand on it, and it would jerk us, and it would go all the way through us, from end to end. It would travel. And we would do that about 3 times," end quote. Another survivor, Sally, remembers being locked in a dark room with another young girl, for hours. They cried and they held each other because they didn't know what they'd done wrong. And it was only later that Sally realized her transgression had been not speaking English. Sally was also sexually abused in the boiler room. And she said one time she started bleeding. So she went to the nurse and told the nurse, a woman, what had happened. And the nurse beat her. The nurse told her that she was lying. And the nurse said, "You better never repeat those words again." Besides all of this horrible abuse at the hands of people who were supposed to take care of these children that they'd kidnapped, the indigenous children were not given the same education as other children. 3/4 of Native students only completed grades 1 through 3. 1/4 completed grades 4 through 6, and only 3% of students progressed past grade 6. They were heavily discouraged from pursuing higher education, as can be illustrated in a letter sent in 1940 from the federal inspector to the administrator of one of these residential schools in Ontario. And the federal inspector is chastising the administrator of this residential school because the administrator had been encouraging Native children to go on to grade 9, and they didn't like this. The letter said, quote, "If we let the Indians go to grade 9, then they'll want to go to grade 10, and then they'll want to go to university, and that's what we don't want," end quote. And it's pretty easy to understand why they didn't want this. It was pretty easy to understand why this was a policy. An educated population is a dangerous one, and it's always been in the best interest of a controlling and out-of-control government to ensure that they only have to deal with a population of people that are not educated enough to understand that their human rights are being violated. For example, Common Core. Common Core, to me, it's my opinion. It's an example of how I feel the school system has been dumbed down. The government wanted Indigenous culture to be stamped out, so they focused on the children. And this can be seen over the course of history many, many times. Children are the future. So if you're trying to shape the future in the way you want it shaped, you target the children. In Nazi Germany, there was the Hitler Youth. In communist Russia, they did the same thing. The Bolshevik government took it upon itself to feed, clothe, and raise the majority of the country's children, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but so they could raise a generation of good communists. They took them from their families and put them in group homes to replace the traditional family environment, because usually the adults in the family were not super pumped about the new revolution. The Canadian government did the same thing with Indigenous children. Take them when they're young enough, separate them from their families and their roots, strip away their individuality until they're little balls of clay ready to be reshaped however you want. Break them down so you can build them back up. Many children who lived in these schools remember the coldness, the lack of any sort of nurturing environment. There was no mother, no father, nobody to come in and tuck you in at night and kiss you. Nobody to care for you when you were sick, no one to give you medicine or read to you or sing to you or rock you or see how you were doing. No one asked you how your day was or told you that they loved you. And by doing this, the government would ensure that these individuals would go back into the world with no sign of who they had once been. But they'd also go out into the world with no clue of who they were. And they would not be able to pass on the traditions and the cultures of their ancestors to their next generation. But they also wouldn't know how to love, because during the most important years of childhood, when you're learning how to love and be loved and show love and give love, they had nothing. Around the age of 16, the schools would just kick them out. They would be like, okay, we're done with you. We have sufficiently broken you. We've sufficiently left you a shell of the person you once were. And now we don't care what happens to you. And these kids, they usually had no place to go. If they went home, they would often not even be able to communicate with their family because they didn't speak their language. And they no longer shared the same culture or history. Sometimes the families wouldn't even accept them back because they'd been raised by white people and they were no longer Native. But white society didn't want them either because they were Native. So they had no place to go, no place to call home, no place to put down roots. Most Native children grew up with little or no knowledge of their original culture. A 1910 history textbook for Ontario Public Schools taught students that, quote, all Indians are superstitious, having strange ideas about nature. They thought that birds and beasts were like men. Thus, an Indian has been known to make a long speech of apology to a wounded bear. Such were the people whom the pioneers of our own race found lording it over the North American continent, this untamed savage of the forest who could not bring himself to submit to the restraints of European life. End quote. Can you imagine calling a person who feels bad for harming an animal, an innocent animal? Can you imagine calling that person an untamed savage? Can you imagine calling somebody an untamed savage when they care for nature and all of God's creatures, big, small? The audacity of that. We haven't even talked about the 60s scoop yet. Such a cute name for such a terrifying part of Canada's history, because stealing people's children and putting them into torture prisons wasn't damaging enough to the Indigenous culture. Between the 1950s and the 1980s, more than 20,000 children were taken from their parents by the government and placed in foster homes until they could be adopted by white middle-class families. Most of these children did remain in Canada, but some were sent to the United States and even as far away as Europe. The worst part of this, many of these children were taken from loving and stable families that the government deemed as unfit. So example, these Native peoples, they lived simpler lives, which they were happy doing, so they wouldn't have a refrigerator. You know, they would have like an icebox, like the old days. And the government would be like, no, this isn't good, so you can't have your kids anymore because you don't have a refrigerator. So you're feeding your kid bad like food. And that was the reason they would take the children. And then, when the government had taken so many children that they didn't have any place to put them, the Canadian government came up with the AIM program, otherwise known as Adopt Indian Metis. This was a government-funded program that was started to promote the adoption of Indigenous children in 1967, and it was the brainchild of Otto Dredger, who would go on to become Saskatchewan's Director of Child Welfare Services. It's ridiculous, I'm sorry. He started a program to basically have children kidnapped from their families and then placed with different families for no reason. And then he became the head of Saskatchewan's Director of Child Welfare Services. Isn't it ironic, don't you think? In May of 1968, CBS News produced a television segment that showed several Native children playing with the reporter as he solemnly looked at the camera and told the viewer that these children represent just a few of the hundreds of children aged 6 weeks to 6 years old that were in need of homes. The reporter says that there's so many children up for adoption because of the rise in illegitimate births and the breakdown of marriage in the indigenous populations. And the government had been taking over 200 children a year, but they didn't have homes for them. Many of the administrators of this AIM program believed that if children were removed from their homes early enough, they wouldn't imprint as indigenous people.
Called AIM for Adopt Indian and Métis, the provincial plan has seen about 500 children find permanent homes. 7-year-old Ricky Barton is one of them. He joined his 3 sisters a year after the program started.
I think that there's been increasing acceptance of the Native child since AIM has operated. I think that part of the reason that a number of these children weren't being placed wasn't so much because of prejudice, but a lack of knowledge on the part of the public that the children were available for adoption and needing homes. We have listed currently 170 children, and these range in age up to 10 years. We do hope, though, as a result of the program, that people of many races will learn to understand each other better as a side effect of the program, but that's not our primary objective. Number of children of Native origin who are finding homes now has increased. 4 years ago, of all the adoptions in Saskatchewan, 1 out of 10 included a child of Native origin. For the past 2 years, the ratio has been 1 in 4 adoptions has been a Native child, so it's increased very much.
Nearly 500 have been adopted so far, but the entire scheme for handling Native children without parents is coming under criticism from the Indians themselves, who feel it may be an attempt at integration or worse. Saskatchewan Indian leaders are now drafting complaints about the system to present to both the federal and provincial governments. At the same time, other provinces have inquired about the plan, presumably with a view to adopting something similar themselves. John Warren reporting from Regina.
So for decades, thousands of Indigenous children were abducted from their homes, their families, their lives, their culture, their traditions, their religion, their sense of self. Over 150,000 children that we know of were sent to these schools, and today it's believed that at least 6,000 of them died in these horrible, cold, dark, lonely, and traumatic places. But some estimate the casualties could be as much as 3 times that number. Some of them died from illness and disease, but others were certainly murdered in cold blood. There's a story, a survivor from one of these residential schools, she said when they got there, because there was no family unit, because there was no one to take care of you, some of the older children would sort of take some of the younger children under their wing and care for them and give them some sort of love. And she said that the girl who did this for her, she witnessed this girl being murdered by one of the school administrators. She witnessed her head being slammed into a tree. And she says now, every time she hears like a glass break, she screams. She screams because that's what that sounded like. The sound of a glass breaking reminds her of the sound of this girl who had taken her in, who had given her love and affection where there was none. That's the sound of her head hitting that tree, and she died. So you do see this a lot in today's Indigenous population. Among the older members who actually were at these schools, they have PTSD symptoms, and how could you even not have PTSD symptoms after experiencing this? I found a 1999 article from the Seattle Times, and it says, quote, of 630 children who attended a church-run residential school for Indians between 1903 and 1948, 45 did not survive. The enrollment register for the Thunderchild boarding school reads like a handwritten obituary passed from one oblate headmaster to the next over a period of 45 years. The article goes on to say, quote, it summarizes with exquisite finality the fate of more than 7% of the school's Indian pupils aged 8 to 19 who died between 1903 and 1948 while enrolled there. The simple word morte, dead, follows the names and numbers of 31 girls, and the word mort, dead, follows the names and numbers of 14 boys. Some Native leaders are calling for a national inquiry into conditions at about 60 residential schools where Aboriginal children were sent until the 1950s and 1960s. Operated by Catholic and Protestant missionaries, the schools were compulsory from 1920 onward. Thunderchild, operated by Oblate priests and Sisters of the Assumption, was eventually torched by 4 desperate young male students on January 13, 1948. This fall, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police assigned an investigator to look into allegations by a former pupil that a 12-year-old boy was beaten to death by authorities at the Thunderchild School 63 years ago. He concluded that Robert Loansinger died of pneumonia. But this hasn't stopped the talk of whippings and psychological abuse that circulates on the dozen reserves near the sites of the school. Jack Funk, 63, a former Canadian Department of Indian Affairs Superintendent of Education, says there may not be a more disturbing story anywhere in Canada of the dominant society's attempt to crush Aboriginal culture. Thunderchild School was probably the best example of Indian education at its worst, he said in an interview. Some of these children who died, such as Patrick Tutosi's, Charlie Tobacco Juice, Joseph Bigear, Emma Northwind, and Alice Lonesinger, were taken home from Thunderchild schools to graveyards at the nearby reserves. Others are buried in a shared grave on the banks of the North Saskatchewan River not far from the school. The bones of still others have surprised contractors excavating new basements in the village of Delmas. But of all the deaths at Thunderchild, the one that has commanded most scrutiny is that of Robert Lonesinger. He was buried on the Sweetgrass Reserve on May 3rd, 1927, the day after he died. Robert, whom former schoolmates recall as a big strapping boy, attended the Thunderchild School from the age of 6. Some say he fell off a swing. Others say that he was savagely beaten to death by unnamed authorities at the school. This version is denied by the police and church officials. There was no autopsy. After gathering conflicting information from witnesses in recent months, RCMP say they have no evidence that Robert was murdered. The cause of death was pneumonia, Sergeant Dell Cousins said. He said he found more than 30 of the boys' former classmates alive. He said he interviewed several people who gave firsthand accounts. Irene Finday, who lives on the Sweetgrass Reserve, is one of the several people who remember hearing Robert's classmate, Solomon Puyak, describe in great detail how his 12-year-old consumptive friend was whipped across the back and buttocks with a thick leather strap a couple of days before he died. Puyak died last year, but Finday vividly recalls his account. Robert Lonesinger, he said something in Cree to his sister, said Finday. She took it for granted that he swore at her, but that was not the case. They took him to the father, priest, who ordered 100 lashes for the boy. They weren't even halfway through the 100 lashes when he passed out. They finished the 100 lashes and then took him upstairs to bed. The next thing the boys knew, they took him to that little hospital in Ballardford. A few days after, they were told he died. Joseph Chicken, 72, who was a classmate of Robert Lonesinger, remembers Robert and others occasionally receiving as many as 100 lashes. I know he had a lot of whippings, most of the time for no reason at all, said Chicken. He added that he must have been in another part of the school the day Robert is said to have been whipped at the end of April 1927. I was talking to him and he had chest pains, and the next thing I heard, he was dead, Chicken said. So this article was written, I believe, in like the 1990s. Hold on. This article was written on December 2nd, 1990. So it's funny because a good portion of this article that I didn't read to you is like, well, you know, a lot of people say this can't be true. It seems to be just gossip and rumor and blah, blah, blah. But now we find this mass burial site of all of these children at Kamloops. And we're starting to wonder, is it just a rumor? Is it just gossip? Is it just something that, you know, parents told their kids to make them behave, as is suggested in some articles I read? I think not. And now there's going to be a greater inquiry, and more of these schools are going to be looked into because they found these children's bodies by using ground-penetrating radar. Some of these kids were as young as 3, 4 years old. I can't imagine that over 100 children died of natural causes, and they were just buried on the school grounds, because you'd think that they'd contact their family if they died of natural causes so that their family could bury them where they wanted to bury them. But no, the reason they buried them in a mass grave was because most likely these kids died from neglect. Allegedly, just my opinion, don't come for me, neglect or abuse. Or maybe they were murdered so that they wouldn't tell anybody about the sexual abuse they were experiencing, even though at that point probably no one would believe them or care, so maybe that's not the motive. There is a documentary on YouTube. It's called The Eyes of Children. It was put out in 1962. It's a great resource to look into if you want to check it out. This article that I found about this documentary and about the Kamloops school, it says the eyes of children captured the spectacle of younger children saying their prayers before getting into their dormitory beds, but it missed something that students would remember hearing every single night after lights out, the sound of a homesick child crying into their pillow. Golly, I learned a lot here. Former Kamloops Indian residential school student Hector McDonald would tell a 2013 Truth and Reconciliation hearing. I learned how to hate. I learned how to steal. I learned how to fight. I learned how to cheat. At the same hearing, Jeanette Jules described a school supervisor going into the girls' dormitory at night with a flashlight to choose a girl to assault. A principal at the Kamloops school in 1910 openly reported to his superiors that he was needing to cut food portions for budgetary reasons. During a 1918 visit, Indian agent J. Smith wrote that dinner portions looked from where I sat to be very slim for growing boys. Smith attempted to ask the boys if they had enough to eat, but in a place where they had been conditioned by force to not dissatisfy a white man under any circumstances, the students answered the Indian agent in the affirmative. So they said, I have enough to eat, because they were afraid. The article goes on to say, but even for those who dodged disease, death, and the sexual predations of staff, Kamloops Indian Residential School presented the cold visage of a place engineered to mold them into people their parents and grandparents would not recognize. Imagine yourself being a 12 or 13-year-old kid, being taken away from your family, being thrown into a place where you don't know anybody. It's like going to prison. Frank Gottfredson, who attended Kamloops for 9 years, told the National Post in 1999.
In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say that this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. A federal cabinet minister, 1883.
I remember them taking me away from my mother and my stepfather. And I can hear them telling my mom that that was the best thing for me, you know, and that not to worry, I would be looked after.
At a Truth and Reconciliation hearing, former Kamloops student Sarah McLeod told of a nun forcing her to throw away a carved totem pole she'd received for her birthday. "Can't you see the devil in there? You throw it away right now," she was told. A student who attended in the 1950s remembered fiery sermons about the eternal damnation that awaited all of them if they didn't abandon their tradition and cultures. He would just get so carried away. He was punching away at that old altar rail to hammer into our heads that we were not to think or act or speak like an Indian, and that we would go to hell and burn for eternity if we did not listen to their way of teaching, she said. In a 1997 interview with the William Lake Tribune, businessman Simon Moses described his first day at Kamloops as the most traumatic experience of his life. Moses had grown up in a loving, intact family, and he had suddenly been plunged into a world of slamming metal doors and rigorously silent meals. "All the hugging I used to get stopped at the residential school. To this day, I have a problem saying, 'I love you, Mom,'" he said. Moses had grown up speaking his own language, but now faced beating and the denial of meals if he was caught speaking Indian. And it goes on. There's a million of these stories. I definitely invite you. There are a lot of other great things on YouTube where people have done documentaries and docuseries about this, so I'm going to link them in the description box. But it's just awful. And now it's actually a positive thing that this discovery has been made, because now we can put a rest to the rumors that this is just a rumor. And now we can go to these other residential schools, because there's like over 60, I believe, across Canada. And we can use ground-penetrating radar to find out if there's more mass graves. And then we can start demanding answers from the Canadian government about why this happened and why it was kind of kept hidden for so long. And that's really the best possible case scenario, I suppose. Thank you guys so much for being here. Let me know what you think about all of this. I know it's heavy and I know it's upsetting, but I really enjoy having conversations with you guys in the comment section. So please let me know what you think of this. Follow me on Instagram. Follow me on Twitter. It's Steph Harlowe on Instagram, Steph_Harlowe, and just Stephanie Harlowe on, no, it's Steph Harlowe on Twitter, and it's just Stephanie Harlowe on Instagram. My voice is going because I've been talking so much for these past couple of days. But also don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Share this video if you think it's worth sharing, and I do think it's worth sharing. Like it if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it, I don't care. But make sure you're subscribed if you're not already, and make sure you're still subscribed if you were already subscribed, because YouTube loves to unsubscribe people from my channel. Also, don't forget to follow my podcast, Crime Weekly, that I co-host with retired police detective Derek Levasseur. He's also a Big Brother winner, if you know anything about reality TV, but it's funny because I don't get that impression from him, but he won Big Brother. He's also my co-host on the podcast, Crime Weekly. We put out new episodes wherever you get your podcast every Friday, and the episode goes up on YouTube channel, on our Crime Weekly YouTube channel the following Wednesday, so I'll link all that stuff in the description box. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time to hear this story with me today, and hopefully raise awareness and share and talk to people, because that's the only way we can change things one by one. And you may think like, oh, I only have like 5 followers on Twitter or like 25 friends on Facebook, but these could be 5 people who didn't know this was happening. They could be 25 people who'd never heard of this before. So no share is too small. And don't forget to check out Glasses USA. The link is in the description box, where you can get 70% off of retail prices on glasses, sunglasses, and contact lenses. I really appreciate you guys. Stay kind, stay beautiful, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.
Battle's going straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're going back from the grave, calling out my name. So you got to let it go. I got blood